this panel, we said what we should really talk about is global investor cabals. And that's what this session is about. And let me just, before I introduce the panel, let me just give you some background. Of course, when you talk about cabals, there's the global divestment cabal for fossil fuel, which was started in about 2012. This struck a chord in 2015 with the fossil fuel industry, and they hired Compass Lexicon with, a law professor well known to everybody to produce some divestment facts. Okay, I'll not comment on the facts. Certainly, this cabal got up the nose of the fossil fuel industry, so they decided to hire Compass Lexicon. Now, you also know what happened now. So this is basically divestment is being from fossil fuels is being shut down. At least there's an attempt to shut it down. Now, actually, for some people, that's good news, because now these investors must invest in fossil fuels and they can vote. Okay, so maybe that's a good thing. But then we also have Climate Action 100+, which also seems to have gotten up the nose of the fossil fuel industry. So they are also under attack. And in fact, this is the headline from 2024, 70 departures from that. But then even they, by their own self-assessment, were saying, actually, even before, they were actually not that effective. So it's interesting that although they think they were not that effective, they're basically being shut down. And of course, the story continues. More left. And we also, of course, have the Global Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance with, again, departures. And the story continues. And this is the latest. So now even coal, since coal is clean and beautiful again, so even the coal cabals are under attack, and there's a lot of pushback there. So we thought this could be a good topic, and then of course we have the good fortune that our colleague Elroy Dimson, who's produced many papers in this area, is producing another paper on coordinated engagement, which is, if you're familiar with Belgian beer, you have one-time fermentation, two-time fermentation, triple fermentation, and he is now in fourth fermentation at the Journal of Finance Brewery. Okay, so, so Elroy will kick this off with talking about his paper, and then afterwards we are very fortunate that Conor Kehoe has agreed to join us. Conor is the chair of UNPRI. I'll not introduce UNPRI now. I think Elroy will do that. And we're very fortunate that he's come to speak to us. We're in London. I think you can speak freely here. And he is also a former partner with McKinsey, so he also has the corporate side angle. And we're very fortunate that Shavana Haythornthwaite, that she has also agreed to join, and she is the legal director of Morningstar. So Elroy, with this little introduction and motivation, why we are here to talk about investor cabals, it's up to you, and you can stand or you can, here's the clicker. Your slides are already here.
That's very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about coordinated engagements, that is engagements that involve a number of different parties working together. This is joint research with two Cambridge-affiliated colleagues. My colleague Ozhan Karakash, once at London Business School when I was there, who we hired to Cambridge, which is where I am now, and Sheely, who is a fellow at Cambridge and who's on the payroll of the London School of Economics. So I'm going to give you a little bit by way of background to open things up. Let me just start with history. We've talked about responsible investing for a very long time. This is an engram graph just to show the times at which mentions of different topics have peaked. So if we look at the first line on here, the light blue line, on socially responsible investing, that had a long period of growth, and the general idea was if you're nice, you do things that feel responsible. Then we had the growth of corporate social responsibility. So that was more directed at investors who should invest in firms that display that they have some sort of social conscience. Then we had the interest in ESG, which peaked some years ago, of investing in firms that had a high score on some hands-off measure of responsibility. And then more recently, what we've seen is a growth in what is sometimes referred to as impact investing, but the idea is that you try to change the way the world is. And that's more of the background to what I'll be talking about. In Cambridge, we have lots of things like this. And we also have the front lawn of prestigious colleges being dug up. This kind of interested me with my Cambridge colleagues, David Chambers and Ellen Quigley. So we wrote a case study which we've used a bit in teaching and published that in a refereed practitioner journal. But just campaigning for divestment is pretty ineffective. We don't know what you should be divesting from. We looked at an early stage on the relationship between rankings from alternative providers of rankings on sustainability. Here's a diagram showing you for all of the companies that appeared both in MSCI and Sustainalytics at the same time, what the rankings were. And you can just about see that there might be a line you could fit through this from the bottom left to the top right. But there's not much of a relationship. If you were doing this for ratings of corporate bonds, for example, you'd see everything plotting on a straight line. So I'm older than a number of you, so I've got grandchildren who pass comments on pictures like this. And one of them declared that this looked like a sneeze. So you might spot some patterns in there, but they're not the important thing. So divestment is ineffective, and so the process of arguing, as many of our students and some of my colleagues at Cambridge do, that it would be a good idea, for example, for our endowment to sell its shares in companies that aren't liked, and therefore pass them on into private ownership. The belief that somehow private equity, private ownership of unpleasant companies will be better for the world than having that ownership publicly known and exposed. That's ineffective. And so that's also Karakash and Sheely and I published an article some years ago in the Review of Financial Studies looking at engagement, where we worked on a very detailed history of engagement from probably the organization with the second longest history of engaging with owned companies, with shares that are owned by the investor or managed by the investor. And for that, we weren't using ratings, scores, or anything like that. We had all of the detail of engagements over a long period. And the database that was retained was largely discursive. It would record the date and the nature of a vote, or of a meeting with the chairman, or of inviting a representative of a target company to come to a conference held by the asset owner. We pooled all of these, and we had the good fortune of knowing what the objectives had been. You can't do this sort of research retrospectively unless you can acquire data on what people aimed to do through the engagement. When we looked at all the engaged companies, we were able to plot performance after adjusting for market cap and for market movements. And that's represented by this blue line, all engagements. Of those, some were successful, some were unsuccessful. If we split out the ones that were successful, the stock price action was favorable. In other words, when companies did what this major asset owner wanted, On balance, that was worthwhile for the shareholders in the target company. Most of the attempts at changing behavior were not successful. And so they are the green line that's marked as unsuccessful. So after half a year, or after a year or a year and a half, on average, performance was neutral. But it's interesting to see that success, which you might expect in all sorts of things, is not the other side, the flip coin to all engagements. The ones that did not achieve success, where there was an objective to change the way the company behaves, that was not something of negative value. And so we went on from that to look at more things. Meanwhile, this has been of greater interest in the investment field. I, for a long time, was chairman of Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund, of the Strategy Council, which looked after the interests of the owners, so not of the asset manager, but of the asset owner. And the CFA Institute, with whom I've had a long-standing relationship, who also set the scene. These are some of the questions that we addressed in a recent monograph. If engagements are interesting, based on one case study, it has to be admitted, can we look more broadly? How should engagements be conducted? Should investors cooperate in those engagements? What's the stock market impact of engagement? And what are the rewards for a successful engagement? So I've shown you one graph of that. We were getting to be somewhat broader than that. So the origins of this are a data set that was made available by PRI, by the Principles for Responsible Investment. And this was a curious prize because they had a competition, and some people would say, well, if you win a competition, there should be all sorts of good things that happen to you, and you'll go on happy outings and so forth. In our case, if you won, you would get access to data, which could take up lots of your time and ruin your weekends. So that was the prize that was on offer. It was a tiny financial inducement. And so PRI, as several of you who've had associations with PRI know very well, set up this competition. And they ended up with a variety of submissions. Those who were involved with it would have more in the way of detail, but here in outline is what happened. Some people said that they would go and talk to people and write about the problem and tell about the stories that might help you form a view about how engagements have worked. And others said, we'll do some difficult sums. So it was me and my two colleagues who said, we'll do sums. And there's another group that said, we'll tell stories. And PRI evidently fell in love with both those ideas, and they awarded 2 prizes, and ours was getting hold of data. So we have the PRI. I don't need to tell you a lot about PRI. It is huge in terms of its network and reach. At some stages in the past, it's looked as though it has peaked, but that doesn't happen. It's well funded and has quite a team behind it. It's truly international. And the assets are beyond anyone's capacity to visualize what those assets look like altogether. There are a set of signatories then, thousands of signatories. Just to give you a feel for those of you who are not from the center of the investment industry, they're just big names. There's lots of investment managers, some examples on the screen here, lots of asset owners, and a smaller number of service providers. So the intention here is not to convey particular names to you, but just to give you a feel that these are leaders in the investment world. And so we prepared a paper. The latest iteration of that is dated spring of this year. It's the first paper that looked in detail at the nature and the benefits of coordinated, collaborative, and international efforts to influence investee companies on E and S, not G, matters. A few of the initiatives were supposedly on G, but actually the governance was governance to do with environmental and social issues. So the paper is also the first to introduce and test a theoretical framework on leadership, in particular the impact of the leader and what the leader brings to the party within the context of collaborative engagements. So what do we mean by collaboration? What are the key features of collaboration? There are advantages to collaborating. You can pool information, you can reduce the risk of working on a project which turns out not to go anywhere. As an asset manager, you can cut duplication, control costs, and also something which we didn't recognize at first, alleviate the impact of extreme activists. So some social and environmental activists have extreme opinions. They may be right, they may not be, and so having a cohort of people who think about these issues helps alleviate the problem of being captured. In my student days, the problem was the gates at the London School of Economics. And at the gates, you would get nobbled as you went into LSE, and there were people who would give you a hard time. You could have people who would give target companies a hard time, but you don't want them to have too much influence because there may be others who are part of a quieter majority. But this does not come free of charge. There's a free riding problem. So if I work on this, you benefit because you're also shareholders in the same organizations. And there's problems that if I'm dealing with this as an asset manager, there's competitors and competition issues, of which I'm not really focusing here on SEC-type regulatory type issues. We're just working with the competition. That's hard. It's difficult and time-consuming. And as I sort of foreshadowed, there's regulatory barriers which you know about very well. So what would PRI be in all of this? PRI is essentially a third-party coordinator, and it can help exploit some of the benefits and alleviate some of the costs that are involved in this. This is only a semi-academic environment because many of you are practitioners in this area, but there is a literature that we build on here. One is on the structure of coalitions, and there are key papers by Hermelin which get frequently cited. If I try to summarize in a phrase or two, Hermelin's position is that without a leader, because of the free-riding problem, it's difficult to achieve the best possible outcome. And it's better if you've got a leader, but the leader has to be somebody that people want, so they have to be credible, they have to lead by example, they have to have superior information, and that leader can establish a reputation for credibility, and that's one of the issues that we research in our paper. And there's a related literature, perhaps less obvious, which is the literature on incentives. There are a number of papers that look at wolf pack activists. These are hedge funds who are incentivized to overcome free rider problems because they can bring in cash flows to their funds, and so their reputational concerns are also important, and that makes being involved in a group attractive to them. So PRI gave us a prize. It was access to data. And this has some wonderful attributes compared to what would often be used in research. Engagements are being logged by a third party, unlike our review of financial studies paper, where they were being logged by the asset manager to evaluate their own performance. There's no possibility of retrospective data revisions. There's no possibility of saying, well, we had this engagement. It didn't do quite what we were expecting, but it did have some very good different effects. So let's score that as a success. There's no opportunity to go back and change the data. It involves multiple asset owners. I'll show you how many in a moment. Not just a single investor that we had in our study. The data set is truly global. And every engagement provides a dated record. We're not relying on ESG scores, which last for a period of time and then may, with a delay, be amended. These are dated records for everything, and PRI's documentation is excellent. So what was our research procedure? I'm not going to go through lots of quantitative tables. I'll just give you an outline. PRI grouped their projects into related themes, and so we were given data on 31 PRI coordinated projects. This involved 1,654 dialogues with a target company. In principle, there might be one conversation, and then there'd be an outcome. But more normally, there would be a dialogue which continues for days, weeks, months, years. There were 960 firms that were targeted in 63 countries. It involved 224 owners from 24 countries with overall AUM of $23 trillion US. And there were a variety of different players in this. And then we brought in a lot of supplementary data, much of it, though not all, from commercial databases, and a bit involved going back through other PRI files. So we present a lot of tables in our paper, which I'll give you the link for at the end. What are our main findings? I'm just going to give you 6 summaries. The first is which countries over that time period were the most engaged, and companies that were located in the US, UK, France, and Japan were most commonly engaged. This has been evolving, and the countries which involve themselves in more engagement with target companies have evolved over time. Which industries? Manufacturing, infrastructure, and wholesale and retail trade. What did the firms look like? They were typically large. They're typically doing their business in countries that are foreign to where they are based. There was typically high ownership from the engaging group, and they had a high ESG score. So these were not dogs that needed improvement. These were organizations which, on balance, did the right thing, but there were opportunities to guide them further. What did a typical engagement entail? The average coalition involved 26 signatories, 2 being domestic investors and 24 being from other countries. So most of the impact would come from people outside of the home market. 14 on average were investment managers, 10 were asset owners, 2 were service providers. The coalition typically involved an inverse U-shape between signatory size and engagement. If you were tiny, you didn't get involved in this. If you were huge, if you were a BlackRock, if you were a Vanguard, you were likely to say, well, it's a good idea, but we do this sort of thing ourselves, and we don't need to involve ourselves with others. What was the structure? It evolved to being a 2-tier structure with a lead. A lead would usually be one organization. Sometimes it would be 2 organizations. And I'll show you the evolution of that. So here's how it evolved. In the early years, there's what we call the single-tier period. So for those of you who haven't looked at PRI's website, take this as me chastising you, because you should, and it's very pictorial. And what you would find is that people have a project in mind, and they'd put something up, and there'd be a group that get together. Many years ago, I was director of the MBA program at London Business School, for which doing a project was very important. And it was very difficult sometimes for those groups to work, because those groups would consist of 4, 6, 8 students, each of whom thought that they were leaders in their field. And unlike say, McKinsey, where you can have it from the expert in front of me, in McKinsey, you will have an engagement manager, and that may rotate. So sometimes you would be part of a team, sometimes you'd be in charge, and that leader is very important to being effective. And so this evolved over time. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see what we call the two-tier period, and there was a period in between when there were experiments where simultaneously there was a leader that was appointed, sometimes appointed by the group, sometimes appointed by PRI. The leader was occasionally two organizations who would lead this, and others were just a group, a little bit like our collection of MBA students, where it was not as functional as it could be. So our third finding, is leadership decisive? The answer is yes, definitely. The two-tier structure elevates success rates. Having a leader increases success rates by about 50%. So all of these projects have an objective, and the objective is more likely to be achieved where there is leadership. This is an important part of our paper, and so we spent a lot of time looking at whether the way in which this result might be flawed, might be misconceived. And so we've done a lot of testing. We've looked at matching the target firms using entropy balancing and propensity score matching. These are techniques which we use in our sort of finance-ish stuff. We identified pseudo-lead investors, in other words, investors that had all the characteristics of the actual leader, but who wasn't a leader, and looking at the difference between the engagements where there was a leader and those where we imagined there was a leader and there wasn't actually. And we've addressed possible learning over time, that investors were learning. We've looked at a variety of different things. It is clear that with a leader, the process is better. We asked ourselves, what are the mechanics, what are the mechanisms for effective leadership? One is having an informational advantage. And so it turns out that this works well when the leader is domestic in the same country as the engaged company. So although most of the group who are involved in supporting an initiative like this come from outside the country, it's having a local leader is important. And having a reputation for credibility. The leader needs to be reputable and typically has an origin in a high social norm country. What are the attributes of these leaders? An investor is more likely to lead a collaboration when it's an investment manager rather than an asset owner, when it has a higher stake and higher exposure in the target, when it's not busy with other PRI engagements. So if you were busy leading engagement number one, you should be too busy to take on engagement number two. There's a limited size to most of the groups that might focus on this. There should be a formal engagement process, and we got details on the nature of the engagement process, and that helps. And typically, although you won't be busy if you agree to lead a PRI initiative, you'll have other things going on with other groups, and so you'll have frequent participation in other collaborative engagements. What are the financial impacts? Target firms in two-tier engagements experience, on average, an improved abnormal return, that is after adjusting for the market and for the size of the company, and improved accounting returns, return on assets. If it's a single-tier engagement, on average, there's no change in stock market return or return on assets. Where the initiative is being led by a signatory that is an asset manager, as is often the case, on average they have increased fund flows following the engagement episode. And so they are rewarded not simply in terms of stock market performance, but they're rewarded in terms of funds flow. So to summarize, success rates are elevated with a two-tier structure. Even stronger improvements are there when the lead signatory is domestic. The target firms in a two-tier engagement have abnormal return and ROA improvements. and signatories experience increased funds flow. Where is this paper? Well, it's gone through several rounds, as Marco was indicating. So it's now in its 4th round of refereeing. Marco has been through this with a companion paper. It's a long process because this is the top journal in the field, and we're optimistic about it, but it's not yet accepted for publication. I showed you a picture of the ECGI paper, and that's up to date. But there will no doubt still be some more requests for us. If you've got your phone handy, this is what you would click to read the paper.
I should add, in Belgium, when it's triple fermented, the leading beer is called Delirium Tremens. And it has a pink elephant as a logo. So I just wonder what quadruple fermented looks like. So anyway, so thank you very much for this introduction. So I think we've set the scene. We know now what the coalitions actually look like, there are actually governance issues about these investor coalitions. I think that came out very clearly. I think you also showed, at least for the PI ones, they can be very impactful. And I think my introduction kind of made the point. Some people really don't like this. So let's turn to PI. I'm not going to call it a global cabal. The leading responsible investor association. I think Elroy already set it up. Conor.
Well, Elroy, thank you for that. It was really interesting to see it all laid out. And of course, I'm here today at a convening of academics, and I hope it's not a conspiracy to reduce the supply of academic ideas into the market. Although I expect that you all do jockey with each other to make sure that you're not overlapping and that you have original research. So convening, I think, is an aspect of many industries.
And our pink elephants.
And our pink elephants. I should add, by the way, that I can recommend Irish whiskey, which is triple distilled. Scotch whiskey is only twice distilled. It's much smoother. So what's going on, I think, is perhaps the question. Why does this all happen? Well, PRI has a dual mission. Its mission first was to integrate that very unfashionable term ESG into investment thinking. And that was 2006. And then added to that was develop a more sustainable financial system, whatever that means. But that came in 2012. I've been recently talking to asset owners who are the dominant group in PRI about, well, this is all very well, this dual mission, but what's the purpose of the organization? What sits above that? And the best answer I've got so far, which I'll share with you, but is work in progress, is that what we want is an organization that integrates what is a very changeable context into our investment thought. And then, of course, I ask, well, why wasn't this needed before? Well, because we seem to be running up against unprecedented problems in our context. Like planetary boundaries really haven't happened to us before. How do we take that on board as a group? And of course, that got me thinking, well, what other unprecedented problems are there? And I can't guarantee that these will be part of PRI's mission, but it's useful to think of a class of problems that are similar, unprecedented and large. So I've come up with two, and I'll let you know how I get on with them. One of them is demographic change. The last time I think we've had depopulation to the extent that we're expecting in Western Europe was the Great Plague in the 1400s, when 25% of the population was killed off. And by the way, wages went up and land prices went down. So it'll be quite interesting to see, as our populations change, if they do, what happens. And how will investors integrate that into their thought? And another candidate that somebody put to me, which might make the grade, was artificial intelligence. If it's really going to affect 35% of work, that could have massive social and economic changes. So if you want to think about what PRI sort of is, it's really about helping investors as a group integrate what are quite new phenomena into their thinking. And I think the US administration is actually having a go at helping investors integrate thinking into their efforts by telling it not to think about ESG in certain things. So they're having a go at sort of shaping minds, let's put it that way, which of course is what investors are asking PRI to do as a collective. Now, why they do it, why they convene and need to do it together is a question I put to you as academics. It's an interesting phenomenon for me. They do need to get, and you, by the way, as academics, need to convene. Why do you need to convene? I suspect something behind it, something about having a common language and a common set of tools, especially if you're in part of a market. You want to know where the market is, and it's not just the prices today, but it's the thinking as well, and that seems to draw them together. And of course, they also have this steward task that you've described. They're not just allocating capital, they're also stewards. And once again their influence can be greater collectively. Now, as to the title, and I'll shut up soon, but is it a cabal? I think what's happening is that investors anticipate policy is going to come about to deal with, in this instance, let's take climate change. It may come about to deal with other things too. And if you anticipate policy, you want your investee companies to be well positioned for it. So they do encourage investee companies to be well positioned for it. Other examples of policy doing this? Well, my favorite example, usually PRI has insurers as its members. So my favorite place to go is the insurers, because they usually see the effects if you choose climate change first. So I can tell you that there is one state in the world where climate change is now so rampant, or so actually impacting so greatly, that properties can't be insured. And if they can't be insured, they can't be refinanced. So the state has set up a state-owned enterprise to do the insuring. And that state-owned enterprise is the largest insurer in that state. And the state is the state of Florida. So you start to see policy having to intervene to protect property interests. In other words, electors' vital interests. So I don't think investors are unreasonable to think that policy will come along. Now, whether they'll guess what the right policy is and whether they'll get the timing right is yet another matter. But I think what they are doing is saying, we can't escape, we can't diversify away from this phenomenon. Therefore, we want to influence our investee companies to be as well positioned as possible. And normally, they're lobbying for them to have things like transition plans or to mitigate the effect of climate change. A second order effect is being tested, which is whether the availability of coal, but that's miles removed from the intent. And why do they seem to be acting together? Because they have a common interest. They can't escape. They can't diversify away from it. So that would be my pithy explanation, not too pithy explanation of what's going on.
They're not a cartel. With this, thank you very much for this morning, for attending this morning's session. Now, before you go for lunch, please all come up to the front, because we want to take a photo of this GCGC, whatever the C stands for.